I think we can all agree that playing complex champions like that of Yasuo, Sylas, Akali, Zed, Azir, Leblanc is some of the most fun that a player can have. I mean, we've all been there where you have those pop-off games of some of these complex champions and you're left feeling, why would I waste my time on Vigar or Galio or any of these kind of basic boring champions when I can just play Zoe or Zed or Yone? But then reality sets in. You start seeing your LP tank, you start seeing that 41% win rate, and you start questioning yourself, maybe I should have listened to that coach, or maybe I should have listened to my friend and actually maybe waited a little bit longer in my journey to play one of these complex champions. And that's exactly what we're going to be covering today. This video is for people that are between the ranks of Iron to Platinum 4 who one day aspire to play one of these complex champions. And we're going to be breaking down how exactly you should be developing the skills and what champions you should be maining to pilot each and every one of these champions. Now, one of the common things I hear on a day-to-day basis is, but Curtis, I really can play this champion. Just watch. I'm gonna show you that you're wrong. I'm gonna main Azir and Silver. I'm gonna be coming back in 100 games, and you know what? I promise you, I'll already be in high gold or platinum before you say the word. And then oftentimes we come back, we circle back, and they're sitting there with the 38% win rate, and I'm having to kind of bring them up from the depths and reinvigorate their journey, and it's not a very fun experience. So the real question is, can you actually play that champion? I've noticed that the Iron to Gold community are experts at gaslighting themselves into thinking that they can actually, quote unquote, play these complex champions. And the reason they feel like this is because they're able to get that one big trade-off, that one big juicy roam, or that one big skirmish, and it leaves them feeling like, if I can do this, if I can make this one really good thing happen in the game, surely I'm good enough to pilot that champion. And so the way I kind of interpret it when someone says, but Curtis, I can play this champion, just look at this play here, they often mean that they're capable of having these kind of minor isolated instances of success within a game. So imagine you have this timeline, right, of all the scenarios that are happening in the game, and there's all these events that they're conveniently forgetting all the the face palming, all the stumbling over themselves, all the deaths. But then they have these one or two pop off moments, or even three pop off moments, and they think just because they can have these small diamonds in the rough that they're able to, quote unquote, play the champion. But the results speak for themselves. So I think for clarification purposes here, to be able to actually play a champion means to be able to perform consistently across many matchups, many compositions, and across multiple patches. You can't, having that one pop-off trade or that one pop-off skirmish isn't enough to say that you can play the champion. Now, before we even go any further in this video, I want to make it very clear. I'm not here to tell anyone to play anything. I'm just giving you my opinion. If you want to go ahead and play one of the most complex champs in the game when you're in Bronze 3, go for it. I'm not here to discourage that. But the reality is that you need to understand what you're getting yourself into. And if you are interested in learning what that experience is going to look like and how you should actually go about it, there will be a slide at the end of this video really discussing, if you did have to do it, what is the most effective and efficient way to actually go about that. Now, I want to quickly talk about how to actually use this video practically. Now, what I'm going to be doing for each and every one of these complex champions, I'm going to be recommending a handful of simpler champions for each of these complex champs to help you develop the necessary skills. Now, with those champions, you have two choices. Number one, you could pick one or two of those simpler champions, go very deep down that rabbit hole of champion mastery until you get to platinum, then you can go ahead and play that complex champion. Or you can pick one of those champions, play 50, 60 games, champ cycle, move on, then go to the next one. Some people like to cycle through many of those simple champions to develop a different view of the game, broaden that perspective, really view the game through different lenses. Other people just want to pick one or two of those, simpler champions, go really, really, really deep, develop that muscle memory, and hopefully get that kind of to Platinum 4 as fast as humanly possible. Both are completely viable. It's purely preferential. Now, if you want to learn more about champ pool cycling and how to actually go about that journey, we actually have a free champion pool course and masterclass in our school community. Link is in the description below, completely free for everyone. So please don't miss out on that. And also, lastly, the MLA has guides for all of these champions. So if you're looking to learn more about how to learn any of these simpler champions or even the complex champions, we have every single guide for all champions with reference points, early lane examples, the whole 9 yards. So if you're interested, check it out. Also, link in the description. Let's kick it off with Yasuo. Now, Yasuo, very popular champion, but there's a few reasons why Yasuo can struggle below platinum. The first one, wave management is not easy or intuitive due to the whole offense's defense kind of necessity, which stems from his necessity to stack up flow, win war of attrition, and stack up that Q. So it's actually very difficult to learn fundamentals and really get a grasp on what you should be doing with waves and how you actually manage waves while also not dying to ganks. So yes, you can bypass this with just taking good quality trades, really understanding your matchups, but it's not an overly intuitive experience. And a lot of people really struggle, whether it by dying to early ganks or again, completely bypassing wave management altogether. The big one, though, for Yasuo is mid game is incredibly complex. It's complex in terms of reference points, and it's also very complex in terms of execution. So Yasuo is one of those champions that can do many things. You can play side, you can play for skirmishes, you can play for pick, you can play for team fight, you can duel people in the side lane. The options with this champion are basically endless because you're fundamentally just a fighter. So for a lot of people in the lower elo brackets, you fundamentally don't have the game understanding and the actual knowledge and experience to be able to break down compositions and be like, based off all these champions in the game, what should I really do in this game? Some games you are going to have to play the side lanes. Some games you are going to have to group. And this really depends on what champions you're paired with. Do you have setup? Do you not? How many auto attackers or champions with, point and click CC do you have, or are you versing? So there's a lot that goes into really dictating how you should fundamentally go about your mid game. And it's Yasuo is a champion that is brutally difficult to team fight with, which is fundamentally one of the main options in the lower tiers. If you go to any silver, bronze, silver, low gold game or lobby, there are going to be a lot of ARAMs, there's going to be a lot of team fights, and that's fundamentally a big part of the lower tier kind of, mid-game macro. The next point here is high mechanical execution barrier. For anyone that's played Yasuo, sure, anyone can go out there, throw EQ, piss out a win wall. You're going to get a little bit of value, but there are a lot of specific win wall interactions. There's auto attack weaving, there's controlling the dash direction. And, when you're in a lot of chaotic fights, learning how to get max value from each and every one of your abilities, pumping out maximum damage is very difficult for the average player. And lastly here, Yasuo scales with game understanding due to being a skirmish-oriented champion, like I was mentioning before, which requires fundamentally knowledge about how a whole host of other champions work. And at the end of the day, when you're in bronze, silver, gold, you just don't have a super sophisticated understanding of how all of these other champions interact with your kit. You just don't have that much experience. So the reality is that a lot of these fighters and skirmishers, they scale with game understanding. They scale with your ability to understand or anticipate what the enemy is fundamentally trying to do to you. And so, for a lot of people, they just don't have that experience. Now, before we move on to what champions I'd recommend, this number over here, what that is going to represent is their win rate in silver currently. Okay, so it's going to give you a rough indication of kind of where they're currently at in regards to their win rate. Now, the champions that if you did want to learn Yasuo, these would be the 4 champions that I would tend to recommend. So Ahri is very good for Yasuo because, you are kind of a skirmish-oriented champion. You need to get a bit messy. You need to be playing with your jungler. You need to be kind of getting involved in those river kind of skirmishes. And because Ahri can approach fights many different ways due to the versatility of her kit, you kind of get that similar feeling of being adaptable, playing with your team, skirmishing, brawling, going forwards. And because you're also quite a low range champion for the most part in your skirmishes, you will feel that whole aspect of skirmishing. The same applies for Echo. Echo has that, obviously there's that melee aspect. You need to go in and kind of heavy trade for the most part and get comfortable, making your lanes a little bit messy, especially with Echo, with your aggressive EQ autos, proccing that passive. Yeah, sure, Echo can be played in a very defensive way where you're just popping those waves and shoving and moving. But if you did want to learn Yasuo, then I would recommend a more aggressive iteration or style of Echo where you really try to min-max your early trading. Not to mention as well, in the side lane, you have dueling capacity and you have shove and moving capacity, kind of similar to Yasuo to a certain degree. Naafiri and Galio, similar, both low-range champions, very skirmish-oriented, want to get in the fight. And so what these champions will really force you to do is not only be aware of where your team is and really attend those key fights, but also playing off key spikes, Galio hitting that Hollowed Radiance, Naafiri hitting that Eclipse, or depending on whatever build path you go for. But also as well, thinking about how your kit interacts with other champions. So Galio and Naafiri really force you to really understand, okay, if I want to do that, can I do that? Like, based off the kits that are in this game, am I going to get CC'd? Am I going to get locked down? Is this the right time for me to use my gap closer? So these champions will get you thinking about using your abilities aggressively and really making sure that you're contemplating what other champions you're being paired with, especially for Galio. There's only so much you can do by yourself. So you need to be very aware and cerebral about what other champions are in the game and how you can kind of facilitate them, which is obviously, Yasuo is not really facilitating other people, but you do need to think about, do I have other champions that are going to facilitate me? So you are kind of thinking about how other champions interact with your kit. So these would be the 4 champs that I would strongly consider working towards, Yasuo in Platinum. Now for Akali. Now Akali can struggle below Platinum for the first reason here is low wave clear. Now for a lot of people, wave clear is a big deal. It feels quite shit to play with low wave clear. And in order to offset the fact that your kit has limited wave clear, you need to trade quite aggressively. You need to posture quite aggressively. You need to get in the enemy's face. And for anyone that has actually tried playing Akali themselves, especially in the lower elo brackets, you will start to realize, holy moly, it's very easy to get shoved in. It's very easy to, basically, get waves slow built onto you. In order to prevent that from happening, you need to get in there with your D shield second win. You need to get in there with your shroud. You need to not be afraid to trade quite aggressively in order to kind of circumvent that low amount of wave clear, which is not a fundamentally easy thing to deal with. Now, not to say it's impossible, it's just not a very intuitive or easy concept to really play around with. The second one is approaching skirmishes is overwhelming due to the amount of ways that you can play fights. So her fighting reference points are quite unclear. Now, the high-level reference points with Akali are clear, right? You want to get onto the squishy targets. You want to play in accordance to your R cooldown. You really want to make sure you're aware of your W cooldown. You've got some key, indicators of when you're strong, when you're weak. But when you reach that fight, it's not that obvious. How do I use my R first and then E? Do I E in? When do I use my shroud? How do I leverage my mobility? Do I hold my E if they have flash? Do I use it early? There are so many ways that you can fundamentally approach a fight mechanically. It can be a little bit overwhelming for people that don't have that experience of how their kit interacts with other champions. And again, like Yasuo, your ability to fight to a very high level with Akali or be consistent with your fighting is fundamentally based on how much knowledge you have about how your kit interacts with other champions. So for example, if I'm approaching a fight as Akali into something like, I don't know, something with mobility, let's say a Kaiser. Well, I'm going to have to use my abilities in a very particular way. Whereas if I'm versing something like a Twitch, I could probably use my abilities in a very, liberal way. I don't really need to be overthinking it. Or, there is a very big difference between an AD carry who has flash and an AD carry who doesn't have flash. Well, I need to understand all these interactions, and I need to be factoring in these interactions when it comes to how I use my abilities. And again, not impossible. It's just something that can be very overwhelming for people in the earlier stages of their journey. Mid-game is a big problem with Akali because your shove and move capacity is not that simple due to your limited wave clear. Again, a lot of the time you're going to have to push the enemy back in that lane to prevent them from shoving you in and kind of get in their face a little bit. So this obviously is not ideal. No utility inside the kit. So if you get behind as Akali, you don't farm very well. You die to an early gank. You fail an all in. Once you're behind, your kit can feel incredibly unforgiving, and it can just feel like you're a minion, right? But you're not really going to do anything. Whereas on a lot of other champions where you have utility, even if you get a little bit behind, you're still going to be able to, provide a little bit of value in that mid game. And lastly here, the kit requires an understanding of how other kits work due to her abilities being very multifunctional. Now, if you think about a lot of Akali's abilities, the Shroud, the E, and the R, they're all very multifaceted abilities. Akali's W gives you energy back. It gives you movement speed. You can attach your E to it. You can hide in it. You can create space. There's so many things you can do with it. The same thing with E. You can use it forwards. You can use it backwards. It does damage. It's a gap closer. It's an escape. There are so many ways you can use each and every ability. So again, for a player to be able to get maximum value from the kit and actually figure out how to use the kit, you need to have very good understanding about your environment and how your kit interacts in many varying scenarios, which for a lot of people in the earlier stages of their journey, they just don't have that experience. So champions that facilitate this journey, similar to before, you've got the likes of Ahri, Echo, Nefiri. Again, these are those kind of El Clasico skirmish-oriented lower range champions that really force you to get in the fights, get a little bit messy. They have a little bit more flexibility with the way they can go for fights, especially with Nefiri and Ahri. I would say these two specifically, they have very kind of versatile kits. Nefiri can use W very dynamically. He can E in, he can E out. He can Q1, then hold, then Q2. There's so many things he can do with his abilities. Same thing with Ahri, whether it's Ahri in and then Ahring out. There's a lot you can do with the way you fight and pilot a lot of these champions. So I love how these champions kind of mimic to a certain, obviously a lesser degree, the style of skirmishing and fighting, the mindset of being a low range, less utility oriented champion. And then obviously Echo for obvious reasons. Obviously, it's not a great kind of comparison. Echo obviously has a lot more wave clear, but you are a low range champion. You have limited utility. You need to get onto those squishies, or it will teach you how to use Fog of War, good quality positioning, getting onto the back line. And then also, again, to a certain degree, dueling to a certain degree. Then you've got Diana and Vex. Now, these two champions, I think Diana as a champion, I've always been on the edge about. I think Diana's not exactly easy, but these two champions will teach you target selection, being able to identify who the members you really need to kill are, patience with your ability uses because they have relatively long cooldowns, and really making sure that you're understanding multi-threat, knowing when to go in with your team, knowing the right timing of your engages, knowing how to position around fights properly, and kind of, I guess, pick out of position targets. So, Diana and Vex are very different to Akali, but they will teach you elements of the skills that will kind of pay dividends in the long run when it comes to playing a very burst-oriented assassin like that of Akali. Now, Sylas. I think we can all agree that Sylas is a pretty complex champion, and as you can see, a whopping 48.75% win rate in silver currently, so not doing too hot. Now, the first reason Sylas can struggle below platinum is because his kit scales with game understanding due to R interactions. You need to understand how to use a wide variety of abilities. And again, in the earlier stages of your journey, you just don't have that experience. You don't have that muscle memory and pattern recognition and experience to really draw from because you just haven't probably played the game to a high level for long enough. The second one is complex adaptable skirmishing required to have reliable success, leads to unclear reference points and difficulty of consistency. So Sylas is one of those champions where people always say, look, they can land a few trades in lane, they can land an E2, they can get a good chunk. But when it comes to skirmishes, they always say, how the hell do I go about this fight? What do I do? When do I in? How do I in? What ultimate do I take? Do I E sideways? Do I E forwards? Do I tank the damage? What do I do? How do I fundamentally approach the fight? And the thing with Sylas, I guess simultaneously the double-edged sword, the beauty and I guess the pain point of Sylas is that there are no two fights that are going to play out the same. And your ability, like many of these other skirmish-oriented champions, to pilot these kind of skirmishes and fights really depends on a very sophisticated understanding of your limits, an understanding of how your kit interacts with a wide variety of other champions and with other champions, while also really understanding how to break down these complex skirmishes on a dime, being able to be like, okay, I know how my kit interacts with these champions. I know my limits. I've got this amount of AP. I'm on this level. This is what I can do. And because you're extremely committal in low range, you don't have time to overthink it. You just got to send it, because a lot of the time, if you're late to one of these fights, you're not really going to provide any impact. So due to this kind of complex, adaptable skirmishing that is really required by Sylas, a lot of people really struggle with consistency. Even if they have a strong early game, they struggle with the consistency and the quality of their fighting. Sylas hates ARAMs and prefers faster paced games, which is not what Gold and below is fundamentally about, right? There's a lot of ARAMs and there's a lot of slower paced games. And a common problem I've heard with people in the mid-late academy is they say they get outscaled, right? They slowly get outscaled, they slowly get chipped down, the game goes to ARAMs and they fundamentally can't function, especially if they don't have access to good quality ultimates. Matchups can play out extremely differently, which requires attention to detail and specific understanding of trading windows, and very unforgiven if not taken. If you're the type of person that, plays Sylas, what you would notice is that some matchups you'll absolutely pop off and other matchups you will really, really struggle. And this is because you've probably got gaps in your matchup understanding, gaps in your knowledge about how the kits interact. Sylas has a kit where if you don't really understand how the matchup works, you're not willing to really push your limits and really squeeze the value of the W, and you're not being super accurate with those E's and Q's, you will just get rolled over. It's really that simple. So this unforgiving nature of your matchups and the complexity and the nuance and the adaptable kind of complex aspect of your laning is not really something that a lot of people are comfortable with. They want this tried and true tested method. This is how the matchup is going to play out. It's going to play out like this because, and this is how, what I can do every single game. And Sylas doesn't really have that kind of same level of structure and replicability like a lot of other champions have. And the last one here is Sylas requires a deep understanding of limits, which takes a metric ton of time and experience. And a lot of people just don't have the patience. You're going to have to int many, 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 many games to figure out how much healing am I going to get here? What does it mean to have 3 points in my W versus 3 points Q here? with this amount of AP and I've got this on my team and I've got these ultimates, how should I be going about these fights? There's just so much really to unpack. This is why the best Sylas players in the world often are pro players, people that have played the game for a very long time and have a very broad, deep understanding of many, many, many aspects of the game. Now, the champions that I would recommend to facilitate this journey are very similar to before. You've got the El Clasico, Ahri, Echo, Nefiri, very skirmish-oriented champions, need to get in the action, very low range. You've got Diana there, obviously to facilitate, being intentional with your cooldowns, picking the right window of engagement, understanding your targets. And that's what Diana really teaches. Galio, to a certain degree, is quite similar because, you can be quite durable depending on the build path. You also need to be very aware of your jungler and really attending as many of those river skirmishes and fights as possible. You do need to have adaptability to chaos. Galio has a kit that can really do that. Galio also has a kit that can be used many different ways, whether they are defensively, proactively, using EE forwards, or using holding W versus rushing W. There's so many ways you can play out fights. And again, because you're fundamentally a skirmisher, there is a lot of overlap there. And the last one I put here is Swain. Now, Swain's a bit of an odd one. Now, the reason I put Swain here is because Swain really teaches discipline and attention to detail, not only with ability usage, but also positioning and an awareness of understanding what exactly your job is or your role in that specific game. And Sylas is exactly that. Sylas is one of those champions where you need to know exactly what your role is. What ultimates do you want to take? What is my job in these fights? Who is fed and who is weak? And how do I need to alter the way I use my kit based off that information? And that's exactly the case with Swain. Swain can be played, can be built tanky and can be played slow. You can play to peel. You can play to run forwards. You can hold your E. There's a lot of discipline and positioning and thoughtfulness with Swain in order to be consistent. And yes, although they play lane quite differently, they are fundamentally both quite low range. And I think that Swain kind of mimics some elements of the mindset that I think would pay dividends in the long run. So, kind of similar to that of the Akali and Yasuo. For these reasons, I recommend the Nefiri and Echo and Ahri. But the rest, a little bit niche there. So again, Sylas is a very complex champion. Definitely not a champion I'd recommend below Platinum. Now, the next champion here is Azir, as you can see, with a whopping 45% win rate in Silver. So not ideal. A lot of people love Azir. I love Azir myself, but a very complex champion. Now, the first point here, he's very mechanically demanding. The auto attack weaving, the soldier positioning, knowing when to E in and holding R reactively or engaging with your R. There are so many, he's not only mechanically demanding, but in terms of how and when you use your abilities in what context is also very, very difficult, right? One of the most common mistakes I see with Azir is when they approach a fight. They don't know when they should be E-ing in forwards and helping their team engage and play the fight fast versus when they should be holding their E, holding their R reactively, maybe being a little bit more passive in their positioning because of how the fight is fundamentally playing out. So you do need to have a very good understanding of reading a fight, knowing the way it's playing out, why it's playing out that way, and knowing your windows and knowing what threatens you and what doesn't threaten you. And that attention to detail is absolutely key. And if you're not really min-maxing that, by the way, and you're missing damage, then there's no point playing the champion because your champion is fundamentally a carry and you're not winning in the early game. So you got to make up the difference a lot of the time in that mid to late. And if you're missing damage, that can be the difference between you winning or losing the fight. Scaling is dependent on the user's ability to side lane effectively, which is not only hard at an individual skill level in these elo brackets, but it's just not effective in gold and below games because there are a lot of ARAMs. Now, look, Azir can ARAM, don't get me wrong, but the reality is that if you're not playing the side lane with Azir, you're not leveraging your tower passive, you're not dragging people to the side lane, you're not, leveraging your dual capacity, you're not, creating man advantages. A lot of the time you will find it hard to get to your key spikes, keep up your farm, and then win the team fights. Now, yes, don't get me wrong. Once Azir gets to that, 2-3 items, then sure, a lot of the time you can ARAM, but getting to that 2-3 items without being able to side lane effectively is borderline impossible because if you don't know how to side lane effectively, you're not going to get much farm, you're going to get ganked in the side lane, and things are going to go south very quickly. And Azir is one of those champions that is completely and utterly tied to items and levels. And once you get behind the curve, it is very, very, very hard to come back. As I was mentioning before, the Azir sex syndrome is often quite contagious and sends people to an early grave. People can't help it. They see the enemy, they look like they're out of position, They send it with their, their EQR, and then they all flash out, and the Azir is this left to rot and dies. And that is a very, very common problem, and it's hard to problem solve because of the dopamine and again, how fun it is to really do that. Now, that's obviously a bit of a meme here. I mean, I'm not going to say that's the main reason you wouldn't play Azir. It's nothing that can't be fixed with discipline, but it is a very common problem I see below Platinum. The next one here is the champion is extremely pro play and high elo skewed. So often the champion gets nerfed quite heavily due to the overloaded kit, which leaves it underwhelming in low elo play. I actually had a conversation with someone in the Midland Academy this morning talking about Akali for a similar reason. I said that the kit, Akali's kit, similar to Azir, is so overloaded. There's so much it can do. So it has to be kind of balanced in a way that really caters for these kind of mechanically competent players or very, very micro heavy players. And if it's not balanced around those players, then the champ is fundamentally overpowered. And the same thing happens with Azir. Azir is one of those champions that cannot ever really be viable in lower elo play as well as being viable in the upper echelons of rank, because what makes the champion strong in low elo would fundamentally break the kit in the upper, in the upper elo brackets. And Riot have been very vocal about this. They want certain champions to be very kind of pro player skewed and very complex, and they want champions to be a little bit more beginner friendly. And we need to just accept that reality. And the last one here is that he's extremely unforgiving from behind. Once you get behind, your power spikes are gone. You're not having that early 3 item spike. You're just useless. You're just going to be rolled over. And for anyone that has actually played Azir and they felt it, you know exactly what I mean. Now, for the champions that can facilitate this journey, the first one's Swain. Now, obviously, Swain, very different to Azir. You have no mobility. Obviously, you're not doing that amount of damage. But again, like I was mentioning with the champion before, Swain really teaches discipline. You need to be very, very aware of your cooldowns. You need to know when you're strong and when you're weak. So Swain is one of those champions that has very, very well-defined power spikes and power troughs. And a successful Swain player, to have successful Swain, you need to know when you're strong, when you're weak. You need to be aware of your summoners. You need to be aware of your ultimate. And all of those things really lead up to having, consistent, reliable results, which is exactly the same with Azir. You need to know exactly when you're strong, exactly when you're weak. You need to know kind of when it is your time to really come online. Now, Veigar is a champion that, really requires discipline with positioning and ability usage, knowing when to hold the E versus use it quite aggressively, knowing how to position around neutral objectives, as well as just overall threat assessment. I think, Veigar really gives you those skills that, again, Azir can very, very much leverage. Syndra here, obviously not easy in her own right, but if you did want to lead towards Azir, I think Syndra is feasible. Syndra will really teach you the micro element of the game. Syndra is a very complex mechanical champion. You can cast abilities while moving. You need to be tight with your spacing and your tethering. You need to be very intentional with your self-peel, with your E. These are all things that Azir also really wants to mimic. Positioning, tethering, spacing, playing at range, leveraging your self-peel with your E properly and not wasting that E ability, among many others. And then you've got Asol. Asol, very similar to that of Swain, teaches you discipline, awareness of your ultimate cooldown, knowing when you're strong, when you're weak. The key thing with Asol, though, that I really like about him for teaching Azir is that he allows you to pick your engage windows. Asol has that special ability, the W, to, send it. You can go in when the time is right with your W, with your R, and pick those really kind of nice engage windows, which is exactly what Azir can do as well. So again, it really mimics that awareness of, or that skill of being cerebral enough to be aware of your environment and understand when it is your time to go. And then Orianna, for very similar reasons as Syndra, you have nice, a very mechanically demanding champion, requires good spacing, tethering, mechanical execution, auto attack weaving, yada, yada, yada. Soldier placement is kind of like ball placement. So yes, there are some beautiful skills that can be developed there as well. So moving on to Leblanc. Now, Leblanc struggles below Platinum, firstly, because she really requires you to push the pace of the game and fight with your jungler. Now, this is bad for two reasons. Typically, the game pace is a little bit slower in the lower elo brackets, and junglers don't know how to play around mid. And I think we can all attest to that. If you've played games below Platinum, junglers don't know how to gank mid. They don't know how to play around mid. They don't know how to facilitate you. They don't know how to help you. And so fundamentally, any champion that really revolves around fighting with a jungler is really going to struggle, especially a champion that does not scale overly well into the mid to late game, especially if you don't have extreme levels of mechanical competence. Skirmish complexity is very high due to the many ways you can play fights and use your abilities, similar to kind of what we mentioned before with Sylas and a little bit with the Akali. right? When you're approaching a fight with Leblanc, there are many ways you can use your abilities. You can look for a double chain, double distortion. You can min-max your damage. You can hold your chain for self-peel. You can use your W for self-peel or to get into the fight earlier. There are many ways to play the fight, not to mention she has a heavy skill shot emphasis and it's just mechanically demanding due to those, skill shots and, many different combos. So for obvious reasons, this can be quite overwhelming for people in this particular elo bracket. Does not thrive in ARAMs, yet a lot of games will lead to ARAMs in that kind of, especially silver, bronze, gold, low gold kind of level of play. The champion is extremely high elo skewed. Patches will ultimately require the player to be extremely competent, similar problem to that of Azir. Champions like LeBlanc that are quite overloaded and have a lot of strength, a lot of versatility, mobility, CC, damage burst. They have so much going on in their kit. They really struggle to balance these champions for the lower elo brackets and the upper elo brackets. This is kind of why Riot have, again, always kind of been very vocal about this. They don't want every champion to be equally viable in low elo play as well as high elo play. And they're going to try their best, but it's not something that is, I don't think, ever really going to be a thing within League of Legends. And then lastly, difficult to keep up farm into mid-game. For anyone that has played LeBlanc, keeping up your farm into mid-game is hard. It's hard to CS. Your major trading ability is your major wave clearing tool. A lot of people don't understand that. It's the exact same problem Fizz has, right? Fizz with your E, your major wave clear tool, is actually your major trading tool. Same thing with LeBlanc and your W. You want to be using your W on the wave, but you kind of also want to be using it for trades. So a lot of people get very overwhelmed. What should I do if I'm getting shoved in? Do I use it on the wave? Do I use it on them? And this is where things like aggressive posturing, really understanding cooldowns, really understanding how to get in the enemy's face, a whole host of other kind of things really come into play. So not to mention in the mid game, because again, your wave clear is not overly amazing. And a lot of games are going to turn into ARAMs. It's going to be hard for you to continue to push the pace of the game while also keeping up that farm. Now, the champions that I would recommend are for very obvious reasons. You're skirmish oriented, you're relatively low range. You can approach fights in many different ways. You have mobility. It does force you to be very aware of your jungler's location and to attend those river skirmishes. So a lot of overlap in terms of what the champ's identity is and how you go about that. Not to mention both very skill shot oriented and have utility with their E. Galio is a champion, obviously very different to LeBlanc, but you have utility. You love skirmishing with your team, attending those river skirmishes, being aware of your jungler, facilitating your jungler, shoving and moving, and trying to attend as many of those key fights as possible. Nefiri, obviously, again, a melee, very different in specifically in the lane phase. But what I will say about Nefiri is that because there is a complexity or a lot of nuance to the way you can go about fights and the way you can use your kit in fights and how you use that mobility. I think there's a lot of kind of intentionality behind the skirmishing that kind of Nefiri requires. And I think LeBlanc would really appreciate that skill set. Obviously, if you were to combine maybe Nefiri and then cycle to something like a Syndra, you would have the best of both worlds. You'd have like this mobile, scrappy skirmisher with a lot of kind of skirmishing nuance combined with a champion that obviously would require spacing, tethering, threat assessment. You're kind of squishy, and then really understanding your windows. And I think what I like about Syndra for LeBlanc is that both these champions don't have overly low cooldowns. They need to be very intentional with their abilities. If you waste a W or an E on LeBlanc, you will get punished for it. But also you both have a lot of burst. And I think both these champions can use their kit to kind of facilitate and play those 2v2s, but they can also use their kits to pick people out of position, leveraging that fog of war. So positioning and awareness in fights is obviously key to success. So I think LeBlanc's obviously that hybrid between like an assassin and a mage, hence why I've recommended some hybrid champions, some assassins, and obviously a degree of mage gameplay here as well. Now, the next one here is Qiyana at a whopping 45.93% win rate in silver. Now, she can struggle below platinum due to the following reasons. Number one, requires attention to detail to a very high level with ability usage, way above the pay grade of this elo bracket. When to take each element. Are you going to get revealed in that grass queue or not? How to position within the grass queue? What should the sequence of my ability usage should be? Weaving in those auto attacks, really understanding how to maybe even, aim your R properly and what angle should I be coming over in the fight. There's a lot that goes into having a consistent time in skirmishes and fights with Qiyana that a lot of people just don't really appreciate. I would say there is a difficulty in keeping up your farm moving into the mid game, leaving her scaling to be quite underwhelming. Now, Qiyana does fundamentally scale quite well, But in order to scale quite well, you need to obviously have a consistent lane phase. You need to know how really, really know your limits so you can kind of push people away and create space for you to farm. And you also really know when to say no to plays, because oftentimes with Qiyana, shoving and moving is not exactly going to be easy because your dueling capacity is not nearly as strong as many other assassins and other champions. So in order to kind of mitigate that, you either need to be very tight with your resets and your tempo, or you need to know when to say no to plays, or you need to know when to simply ditch ways to attend those key fights and leveraging your strong skirmishing. So the actual execution of the mid game in terms of those transition periods, your lane assignments, how you and navigate those side lanes, how you sweep it to get in position and create fog of war, all of those little things that really lead up to those big team fights are what a lot of Qiyana players struggle with. A lot of people can get to a key fight, piff out their art, pump out a lot of damage and a bit of utility, but what they do in between those moments is what will win or lose a lot of Qiyana's games and breed consistency. Now, she does have clear reference points at a high level, but she has high complexity in fights. The skill expression is limitless, very similar to that of Sylas, Leblanc. There's a lot of ways you can actually go about fights. So just because you kind of know what she wants to do doesn't mean the actual how and the execution is simple. And a lot of people kind of forget about that with her. And then the last one here, or the second to last one, is difficult to execute lane phase that can explode very easily if one mistake is made. Now, yes, the whole thing about getting shoved in, playing off the bounce is not that complicated. But what happens if you don't get to play off that bounce? What happens if they hold their CC? What happens if they space you and tether you? What happens if you take too much damage? Those are the sorts of kind of headaches that a lot of Qiyana players don't really know how to solve. And especially in the later stages of the lane, especially around level 6, level 7, a lot of mages and a lot of assassins are going to start getting up in your face. That's where some problems can really start to arise. And that versatility, flexibility, and kind of adaptability in lane that is really required as a Qiyana player is not something that a lot of players are comfortable with. They want that more consistency, reliability, and clearer reference points in that lane phase. Now, I will say Qiyana is hard, but she is one of the few complex assassins that is feasible to learn if you put your mind to it. As we've been going through it, I have kind of been mentioning that she does have relatively clear reference points. She does have utility, and her mobility is not super hard to utilize. So out of all of the complex champions of the list that we've covered here today, Qiyana is the one that I'm like, if you kind of are very intentional about that learning journey and you get someone to coach your gameplay, and you check out a guide. We actually have a really good Qiyana guide inside the Midnight Academy. If you really kind of go about that journey intentionally, it is possible. I think Qiyana is one of those champs that is very much possible and a little bit easier than some of the other assassins. Now, very similar to what we've been mentioning before, Galio, Nefiri, Ari for obvious reasons. And then we've weaved in here the Echo and the Diana here as well, because obviously Echo, Diana, both assassins, they need to get in there, very skirmish oriented. I think Diana probably more so than Echo. Diana has that big kind of ultimate, skirmish oriented ultimate, really requires attention to detail with key targets. You don't really have a get out of jail free card like Echo has. Echo can kind of get in, get out. Qiyana is very similar, where you're kind of like a one-way or the highway type champion, where you really need to be specific as to what your window is, when you're going in, how you're going in, who you're going to go on, that whole process. And I think Diana really kind of leverages or develops that skill set. Obviously, the lane phase is going to be very, very different. But again, the mid game, I think there's a lot of overlap there that Qiyana would really much appreciate. Echo, I would say, does differ. You have a lot more wave clear. I would say maybe even your dueling capacity of the side lane is a little bit better, and your tower taking capacity. But in saying that, you're still a low range assassin. You're still very burst oriented. You still need to be very particular about your engagement windows, leveraging fog of war, getting onto those squishies. So I again, similar to that of Diana, but not to the same degree. And then, yeah, the Galio, Nefiri, Ari, skirmish oriented champions, love fighting in the river, being aware of the next fight, fighting around neutral objectives, scrapping with your jungler, very mid to low range champions that really require you to be aware of your environment and have flexible skirmishing with those very kind of versatile kits. So very similar to the other champions as well. Moving on to Yone. I would say Yone, out of all of the champions that we've covered so far, is the one that the most people get tripped up on. Yone has a whopping 48.6% win rate over in silver, and a lot of people get tricked. They think they can play this champion, but when push comes to shove, they can't. We're going to get into the reasons why. One of the most important things to understand about Yone is that you can have as good of a lane phase as you want. Yone's mid game is hyper complex. He has complex mid-game macro, he has unclear reference points, and he has very difficult to execute fighting. Yone is a bit of a jack of all trades, like Yasuo. He can do many things. He can duel people in the side lane. He can split push a little bit. He can skirmish. He can pick. He can team fight. He can do everything. It just depends on what the situation demands, what champions are in the game, and how strong or weak he is in that particular game. And so a lot of people, they're 2-0, they get into the mid game, they get their balk, and they're thinking, let's go. And then they just don't know what to do. Where do I go? What should I do? Should I fight this? Should I not? And even if they do get to the fight and they pick the right fight, how do I go about it? Stacking up your Q on jungle camps or neutral objectives before the fight is unintuitive. Knowing when to go in with your R and knowing when to go in with your R, how to go in with your R. Do you dive the backline? Do you not? Because think about it, you're not that burst oriented. It's not like you're playing Akali or Vex or something like that is 100% very burst oriented. You kind of require a little bit more of an extended fight. In a lot of scenarios, you're not going to have that opportunity to take that extended fight. So I think a lot of people get really tricked because they have a good early game, but when push comes to shove in mid game, that's where the complexity really, really kind of ramps up. He requires high levels of efficiency and farm to get to key spikes. He's a champion that is completely and utterly dictated by his items. And once behind and your spikes are delayed, feels brutally hard because he has very limited utility. He has an infinite skill cap in terms of skirmishing and how to play out fights, which a lot of people find overwhelming. And he does not enjoy ARAMs, which is what this ELO bracket is typically all about. Now, note, like I was mentioning before, if you're one of those viewers right now that is saying, you know what, I feel like I'm winning a lot of my lanes and surely I can play him, I would strongly urge you to reconsider that position because, again, mid-game is a whole different beast. And I've worked with players that have had literally 400 games on Yone in silver and gold, and they can't get out. They need to just chample cycle, move on to something simpler, and come back to the champion because mid-game is a whole different beast. Now, the champions that facilitate this journey, I've got here an Nefiri Ari for similar reasons as mentioned before. Low range, versatile skirmishing, have a little bit of utility, intentionality with their ability usage, kind of all those reasons. Echo and Diana, what I like about these champions for Yone specifically is that they teach attention to detail with engage windows, knowing who your targets are, knowing when you're at your key spikes, when you're strong and weak, and really understanding, where you are in reference to other people in the game, right? Because Echo and Diana a lot of the time struggle to do things alone. They really need to be leveraging multi-threat. They need to be leveraging the fact that other people are getting involved in the fight. And then again, because if they go in by themselves, they're going to get CC'd, they're going to get locked down, they're going to get isolated, and they're done. Yone is the same. You can't be going in by yourself. The Leon is going to stun you. Nautilus is going to hook you. The jungle is going to CC you, and you're dead, right? Because you're just going to get one shot. So these champions really teach you that attention to detail in terms of your engagement windows and really teach you how to leverage multi-threat and fog of war and, good quality target selection. Yone is a very deadly one. Watch out, guys, for this one. Moving on to Zed. Everyone loves Zed. 48.45% win rate in silver. Zed struggles below platinum due to the following. Difficult to execute in games where there's a lot of ARAMs and team fights, especially if you're going lethality-based builds. Now, there's kind of two builds with Zed. You have like the lethality, more burst-oriented setup, and you have more the fighter Zed that's a little bit more bruiser-oriented, more better quality team fighting. Now, the problem is that even if you were to spec into the fighter-oriented team fight version of Zed, that is a very, very hard to execute iteration of Zed. And if you're trying to play that in, below platinum, good luck. The complexity of your team fighting and mid-game macro, it's just not going to be feasible. Whereas the lethality-based build, even though it has clearer reference points, what your job is, it's a lot harder to execute in the mid-game in those team fights in ARAM. So there's a bit of a, it's a bit of a lose-lose scenario when it comes to Zed. Now, Zed, very similar to that of Yone, has that same effect where a lot of people can minimize lane. They can kind of get to their key spikes. They land a few WEQs in lane. They're feeling really chappy about their early lane. Mid-game rolls around, and then they're feeling, they're running around the map like a headless chicken. How do they play the mid-game without TP? Do I shove and move? Do I not? What if I don't win the 1v1? What happens if I can't play the team fight? What happens if they're all stacking armor? How do I play the team fight if I can't one-shot anyone and they're holding their self-peel and CC? The amount of problems that are going to come up in your mid game are mind-boggling. And that's where, again, it's those transition periods. It's how to stay efficient. It's how to keep up your farm. It's trusting that you can scale with Zed. That's what a lot of people don't understand. Zed is one of the most heavy scaling assassins in the game. People don't understand that. And the reason they don't understand that is because in order to leverage the skirmishing and team fighting and just overall capacity of the kit, you need to have very sophisticated understanding of how other kits interact with your champion. Requires discipline and very high levels of threat assessment in mid game, far superior to this elo bracket. Remember, Zed does not have any utility inside the kit. So if you're not min-maxing your damage in fights and you're playing too defensively and you're not going in and really having your presence felt in fights while also valuing your life, you will become useless and people will ignore you and you're going to be irrelevant in the mid game. Many ways to approach skirmishes, which requires a deep understanding of how other champions work, like I was mentioning. And like I was mentioning before, the kit has zero utility, which makes him extremely unforgiving from behind. And even if you are ahead and you fail to execute a fight properly, your damage can be negligible. And then again, you just lose. You just lose really that quickly. And that's something that I've noticed reviewing a lot of Zeds. They get themselves into good positions. They misplay one team fight where they can't get onto the back line. They miss their shurikens. They get locked down. They have to disengage with their flash, whatever the hell happens. And then it's like, well, mate, you didn't do any damage in this fight. You've got yourself into the best possible position, but you just don't know how to team fight. And team fighting with Zed is not exactly easy. Like I was mentioning, Zed is very similar to Yone. He's falling into that I can win lane trap. Now, champions that facilitate this journey: Nefiri, Ari, all the El Clasicos like we've been mentioning in this video. You've got the versatile skirmishing like that of Nefiri and Ari. You've got the dive-oriented kind of assassins with the Echo and the Dyna really allowing you to learn target selection, fog of war usage, knowing who you can kill, when you can go in. I really like Diana as a comparison in the sense that she has relatively high cooldowns, so you really need to be specific with how you're using your engages with Diana. Same thing with Zed with your ZW. I like Echo in the fact that you can go in and out of fights, so you can go in, get a bit of damage, get out. I like Ari for that same reason. You can get in, deal a bit of damage, get out, go in, go out. And I like Nefiri in the sense that he does have that very kind of committal engage with the R, which is kind of similar to Nefiri as well. And so I think that all of these champions, they don't really mimic Zed, but they all kind of have flavors or certain skills that will, beautifully eventually translate into Zed later on in your journey. And the last thing I'd mention here with a lot of these champions is they all have relatively solid wave clear, and they all have non-committal wave clear, which is exactly what Zed has. So that the lane phase can feel quite similar to a lot of these other champions. Now, the only other one that's a bit odd here is Vex. Now, I've mentioned Vex because similar to that of Diana and Echo, it really teaches you, discipline with your engage windows, knowing exactly who you can and can't kill. And it also, I would say, has a kind of a relatively similar lane phase, which is going to sound bonkers. But if you think about it, right, Vex trades in a very kind of very traditional sense. It's like you wait for your fear to come up, and then you go for the E, then you go for the Q. It's kind of the same with Zed, where you wait for your W to come up, you go for the W, you go for the E, then you go for the Q. It's kind of like this very kind of one, big burst-oriented trade. So the lane phase feels quite similar in terms of the trading patterns to a certain degree. Obviously, it's a bit scuffed, but it is something I noticed. But the big one is obviously the mid-game target selection around key fights, positioning, discipline with your ability usage, and really being patient with your engage windows. Because if you go in too early, you're not leveraging that multi-threat, you're not going in with your team, you're going to get isolated, you're going to die, you're not going to be able to get access onto those key pivotal targets. So moving on to Taliyah. Now, I have a soft spot for Taliyah. I love this champion. I think a lot of people do, but as you can see, this is the win rate in silver, 45.55%. It's not looking good. And now these are the reasons why Taliyah players struggle below platinum. Pure utility, no damage ultimate, which requires a whole host of other skills to fully leverage. You need map awareness, tempo assessment, good quality lane assignments. You need to know how to deploy on the map. Your camera panning needs to be very sophisticated. You need to be able to gather a whole host of information to be able to figure out, okay, well, given the map state, how could I be using my R creatively to create some sort of man advantage? Now, I know Shock has a bit of a take on Taliyah where he thinks that you don't really even need to use your R at all, basically, to Diamond 4. And you can get to Diamond 4 purely leveraging the QWE and play like a front-to-back champion. You can do that. It has been proven. Do I think that is the best kind of way to do that with Taliyah? Probably not. I think there are many other kind of better quality mages that would really leverage that. Like, why play a champion where you're not going to be leveraging their ultimate at all? But yeah, Shock and I are on common ground whereby, the ultimate is just hard to teach. It's an extension of game understanding. Sure, we can help you with the reference points of creating man advantages, gathering information, looking for those shove and move angles. But again, it's not it's not overly intuitive, especially when you feel like you're a victim of the game and you're reacting to a lot of events. Because what you find in practice, in most people's solo queue journey, is that they don't have complete clarity over how the game's going to play out. They're on the defense because their mental stack is overwhelmed. They're not able to utilize their lull states. And so they're inherently reacting to a lot of things happening on the map. Taliyah is really good when you're the one dictating the pace of the game. When you're ahead, you're shoving and moving, you're getting a lot of prior, you know exactly who the win con is, you're gathering all that information, you're not dying, you're being patient, then the kit kind of comes together and it all makes sense. But until that point, it's very, very hard to get a handle on this ability or have any sense of consistency. She's very heavy skill shot oriented, while also being low range and limited mobility, which is not easy to execute. Because if you think about a lot of other champions that have limited mobility, they either have higher range or a lot more reliable trading in lane that are a little bit less skill shot oriented. She requires a high level of champion kit interactions to get maximum value from the WE combo, both reactively and proactively. You need to know how to use that WE in certain scenarios based off who has dashes, who doesn't have dashes, have they used their dash? Should I hold my WE to chain CC it with another ability, or should I start the fight with it? There's a lot of complexity and nuance with how you actually get max value from those abilities. She can ARAM, right? So to be fair, she can ARAM, but she will get beat by a lot of other mages in this position. If you rock up to an ARAM with a lot of other easier to execute mages in this elo bracket, you're just going to get out damaged a lot of the time anyway. Trading patterns are quite unique through the usage of worked ground, which is not overly intuitive. And it's quite heavy on the mental stack, being able to identify where the worked ground is, how you're positioning your queues and getting value from those worked grounds passive. Now, the champions that I would recommend for developing the skills to play Taliyah later on would be Ahri, Syndra, Asol, Ori, and Victor. Now, you've kind of got these three mages, the Syndra, the Orianna, and Victor, for obvious reasons, quite lane-heavy, immobile mages, require good positioning, good spacing, good tethering. They require you to get up in the enemy's face, look for high-value abilities through the wave onto the enemy, intentional ability usage, and obviously threat assessment. Develop that threat assessment. So that all makes sense. I like Asol. You have a go button with your W. You can create those man advantages with your W. And so it kind of mimics Taliyah's R to a certain degree. So if you see people out of position, you can find those very aggressive W angles. And I really think Asol leverages that and teaches that skill. So I think there's a lot of overlap there. And then you've got Ahri. Ahri is also a very low range champion, doesn't have the strongest early lane, and she really forces you to be very aware of your jungler, which is exactly what Taliyah wants to do. Taliyah typically wants to complement other people's plays, shove and move. Ahri is a shove and move oriented champion, post wave clear breakpoint, and really playing the map, which is what Taliyah does. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of the reference points. Obviously, the way you play fights is different, but the high level reference points at a macro level is quite similar. So those would be the champs that I would recommend. Now for Irelia. Now, surprisingly, she actually had a pretty high win rate in Silver. She had a 51.29% win rate, which is a bit odd. But I have worked with a lot of lower elo Irelia players, and it's definitely not an easy journey. And the main reason is that the mid game is extremely complex due to not only the execution of your abilities in fighting, but also your reference points. Irelia, like many of the other fighters that we've mentioned here today, Yasuo, Yone, she can do many things. She can skirmish, she can team fight, she can side lane, she can split push, she can duel. There's a lot she can do. Now, choosing the right play is entirely dependent on what the game state is, what the map state is, where your team is, if you're at your key spikes, do you win the 1v1, how much armor do they have? All of these things. Now, yes, you can simplify it and you can be like, all right, I want to get to my Borg and team fight around neutral objectives. Great. You can definitely employ a degree of reference point simplicity, but even then the execution is then very difficult. I mean, rocking up to an ARAM team fight is not easy. How are you, landing your E's, getting in range to use your R, what happens when you don't have your flash, what happens if you're not able to keep up your farm and you're behind the curve in items. These are all the problems that are going to be cropping up. She does not overly thrive in an ARAM. She can team fight around neutral objectives, but if you're straight ARAMing in the middle of the lane, that's where things can get pretty ugly. She's very unforgiving from behind and volatile due to ganks, due to non-committal. She has no non-committal trading patterns, right? She's a pure melee, right? Very similar to Fizz in that sense, right? She has no, it's not like you're playing, an Akali, she has Q, or Diana, she has Q, Echo has Q. A lot of these other melees have some sort of kind of committal CSing ability. Irelia does not have that. kit requires an understanding of how other champions work to get value from both your W and your E, right? What damage are you going to be mitigating with that W? Or how are you going to be using your E? Are you going to be using your E1, holding, baiting out that mobility, then E2ing? Are you going to be rushing it? Are you going to be chain CCing it? What are you going to be doing with that E? So it requires a very large amount of awareness of how your kit interacts with a wide variety of other champions' kits. And lastly, there are many ways to approach fights mechanically. So she's very prone to mental stack overload. And anyone who has played Irelia would understand that playing this champion is very mentally overwhelming, especially in the lane phase, weaving in those trades, not dying to ganks, and actually executing upon those fights mechanically requires attention to detail and ability usage that is far beyond this elo bracket pay grade. Now, the obvious choices here, Nefiri, Galio, very skirmish-oriented champions, very committal, definitely need attention to detail with ability usage. They need to be aware of multi-threat, leveraging other divers, and really picking those engage windows so you don't get isolated and killed. There's a lot of complexity and nuance to these abilities. Nefiri with the way she uses W, Galio with the way he uses R and W and E. There's a lot of nuance there and very kind of requires an understanding of the context, which I think Irelia is obviously quite similar. And then you've kind of got Echo and Dinah really picking your engage windows, looking for those shove and moves in mid game. Dinah, very ultimate reliant champion, very similar to that Irelia. Really needs to know how to get maximum value from that ultimate and get onto those key targets. And then Echo, I would say similar in the sense that very item dependent champion really needs to know when you're strong, when you're weak. You need to be able to say no to plays, really value your farm, be quite efficient, and really leverage your stronger side landing, which obviously Irelia has as well. So there's a lot of overlap there. Obviously, each of them are overlap in differing ways. But unfortunately, Irelia is quite a unique champion in the way that she plays the game and the way she plays fights. So there isn't a perfect fit here. These are probably the best. And if I were looking to play Irelia later on in your journey, I would definitely cycle through multiple champions to really diversify your skill set to make sure you're properly, prepared to play this champion. Now for Zoe. Now, Zoe's number one concern is wave clear, right? And in order to offset your low wave clear, you need to be trading very aggressively, posturing very aggressively, and you need to have a very significant knowledge of your limits to offset that. So if you look at any high quality Zoe player, they're not sitting back behind minions. They're getting up in their face. They're coming in from the side. They're posturing up outside the wave. They're really, poking down the enemy. And this is something that is very mentally overwhelming. And it's hard to do that without dying to ganks while keeping up your farm, contemplating resets. There's a lot going on in the mental stack of Zoe players. And the champion is surprisingly difficult. And a lot of people don't really know that until they play the champion. She can ARAM. So to be fair, she can ARAM. But success is often dictated by skill shot usage, the quality of your skill shot usage, as well as levels of anticipation. Now, this is not overly intuitive to develop in earlier stages because you just don't need to have a very sophisticated understanding of what other champions do. But Zoe really does, because if you miss those skill shots and you're not anticipating why they're moving the way they are, why they're using the abilities the way they are, do they have mobility? Do they not have mobility? And really factoring in all those things, it can get very difficult to get into the right position, land those skill shots. Third one here, hard to keep up farm. I think anyone who's played Zoe will know that fact. Farming on Zoe and keeping up your farm is hard. So for multiple reasons, you have low wave clear, which you'll definitely feel in the mid game. You lose a lot of side lanes in the mid game, which is obviously not easy. A lot of Zoes even like to take Ignite, which causes a whole host of problems moving into your mid game. And I would also say in general, because you have limited mobility, you're surprisingly squishy, and a lot of people really hunt you down in the side lane. So, Zoe's one of those champions that, because you have limited wave clear in combination with limited mobility, it can get a little bit tricky. And then lastly here, high skill cap mechanically and reference point wise, moving into key fights due to mass skill shots and creative playmaking potential. There are many, there's a lot of summoners and things that you're going to be picking up with your W, and there's a lot of skill expression there. There's a lot you can do with your R. There's a lot you can do with your kit, and there's a lot of skill expression in those skirmishes. And again, a lot of people in their earlier stages kind of want a more simplified, streamlined approach to the way they're going about fights. They don't want to have to think too much about, all of the crazy possibilities of how they could have piloted fights. And this is one of the main reasons why Zoe's quite tricky. And so the champions that I would recommend, the first one is Swain. Swain, I have been kind of mentioning quite a lot in this video because He really teaches attention to detail with ability usage. He really requires good quality positioning, awareness of when the next neutral objective is, and being at the right place at the right time. Zoe's one of those champions where if you're late to plays, you're fucking useless. You're not going to do anything. So, something we actually spoke about recently in the Zoe guide we made for the Midland Academy is, watching Chovy as well, is that he's always getting into the right place at the right time, and he's sacking sideways. He's always kind of overemphasizing being grouped with the team, because he knows that as a Zoe, if you're not there with the team and you're not getting into position, you're not pummeling the enemy with poke from a distance, it's going to be hard to have your presence felt. You're just not going to deal that much damage. And Swain is very similar in that sense, but obviously not with the poke, and obviously not with how you play the fight itself, but more so the positioning and the underlying macro. Ari, you're a low range champion, quite versatile in the way you can play fights. Obviously you have mobility. Zoe doesn't really. So there are some differences there, but playing mid to lower range champions, a little bit scrappy, again, skirmish oriented, which Zoe very much is. Syndra, Victor, Ori, spacing, tethering, skill shot usage. These are big parts of playing these champions, which is exactly like playing Zoe. If you miss your abilities, you're not really playing on that, on your tether. You're getting sloppy with your movement and your positioning, you will get punished. And obviously these champions don't have mobility either. So these are champions that definitely mimic a lot of the skills required to learn this champion. So if you can combine the Ari and the Swain and cycle through to some of these immobile control mages, that's where you can really get a taste of the skills that are required to learn this particular champion. And lastly, we have Talon with a whopping 47.91% win rate. Now, Talon struggles similar to Taliyah because she has a very utility-based ability, right? So her, Talon's E is kind of one of those abilities that is very easy to underutilize. If you're not really properly min-maxing that terrain scaling in the mobility aspect of this ability, you have one less damage ability than every other champion in the game. And because, at this stage of your journey, you don't really have probably sophisticated skirmishing, you don't really have, high degrees of understanding how to leverage man advantages, fog of war, tempo, playing the map, it's something that will fundamentally just always get underutilized. He has extremely complex skirmishing and fighting due to the damage requiring the passive proc, which is unintuitive and hard to execute. A lot of people that play Talon for the first time are like, why is this champion so hard? Why do I do no damage? And it's because you don't know how to proc the passive. And so this is why Talon is basically an OTP champion, and a lot of people have to put in hundreds of games on this champion to really get a feel of how to deal damage, and especially how to deal damage in team fights. Now, sure, you might proc your passive in lane with your W, Q, auto, whatever. But when it comes to team fights specifically, good luck getting onto the back line without getting bursted, getting your passive off. It requires good quality positioning, tempo assessment, shoving and moving, very hardcore, attention to detail in terms of, is the enemy's mental stack overloaded? Have they used their CC? There's a lot that goes into pumping out that damage. I mean, just watch Lurks. I'm a big fan of watching Lurks' gameplay, his team fighting. I've watched many of his montages, and I'm still mind boggled to this day how that guy gets damage off. And, it's very, very easy to basically do nothing in a team fight. The third point here, Talon requires the player to utilize fog of war and multi-threat far beyond this elo bracket's pay grade, like I was mentioning before. Does not like an ARAM, which is what this elo bracket is fundamentally skewed towards. And the scaling functionality of Talon is only unlocked by high levels of mid-game macro, team-fighting positioning, and extreme awareness of levels of self-peel, very similar to that of Zed. It's very easy to, in the lower elo brackets on champs like Zed and Talon, to just do no damage in a team fight. I'm sure we've all seen it firsthand. It's not overly fun to see. So the champions that I would recommend, we've got the El Clasico, Nefiri Ari, skirmish-oriented champions, mid to low range, want to get in on the action, and have that kind of versatile fighting and ability usage similar to that of Galio. And then you've still got here the Echo and the Diana for very kind of attention to detail with fog of war, positioning around neutrals properly, getting onto the right targets, and really making sure that you're playing with tempo to make sure you're at the right place at the right time. So relatively self-explanatory. Now, if you were paying attention throughout this video, there was a champion that kept popping up, and that was Ari. Now, Ari was in this video quite a lot, or referred to in this video quite a lot, for 5 reasons. She has a low skill floor and a high skill ceiling, which really rewards champion mastery. And a lot of people can kind of get in there at a baseline level and really feel what it's like to play a very baseline solid skirmisher. She's rewarded for intentional ability usage and poise. If you're patient, you're very aware of why you're using the abilities the way you are, specifically with charm, right? Holding your charm, knowing when to hold it reactively versus proactively, chain, using your Q on other forms of CC to make sure you get the Q1, Q2, or even getting rewarded for getting the reset on the R. So very, very much rewarded for intentional ability usage, mage-like and assassin-like aspects. Right? If you're a mage wanting to learn assassins or assassins wanting to learn mages, it goes both ways. This champion really has that overlap, and she's that bridge between both classes and archetypes. She has mobility, utility, and damage. So she's fun to play. She can zip around, she can deal damage, she can facilitate other win conditions, she can do a little bit of everything. So that kind of gives people that power fantasy of many different aspects of the game. And she also has clear reference points, right? Which is a big part of why Ari is recommended in our program as well. Now, if you absolutely had to play one of these champions and climb to platinum with them, how would you do it? So number one, what you would do is you would find the most cookie cutter setup possible. So if you're playing Zed, Electro, TP with Eclipse on Zed, boom, like just a very stock standard setup. It may not be the best, but you really want to kind of limit the amount of variables and really double down and get very good at a particular build path. You'd want to OTP the champion with no pull, right? I wouldn't want to see Talon and Zoe. I wouldn't want to see Akali and Katarina or something like that. It would just be silly. I would find Western players who main your champion and look for ability usage, basic skirmish tips, and trading tips, okay? So there's a key why it's Western and not Eastern. So what I've found with Eastern VODs is that typically they play out very different to the West. If you're in NA or EU, how the games play out in Korea and China are just fundamentally very different. So I just don't find them overly replicable or that helpful, to be honest. And really what you're looking for is not really strategy. You're looking for how are they using their abilities? Why are they using their abilities that way? You might just go through a few trades in the lane. You might go through a few basic skirmishes and team fights and really look for, again, a lot about trading and ability usage and fundamentally pumping out damage. Then what you would have to do is adapt your style to fit your server and your rank. Do not copy high elo. What works in NA Challenger or EU Challenger is not going to work in NA Silver 4. It's just not going to work. You need to find what works for you. That might mean that you have to group a little bit more. It might mean that you have to, adapt your build a little bit more. There are things that you will have to do to adapt that whole champion to fit your particular style. And last one, just get coaching and drop the ego. A lot of people just are too proud to get coaching. If you're playing a complex champion inside a complex game, don't complain that you're not climbing after 600 games on the champion. The game is hard. The champions are hard. Get some coaching, get some advice, and it's going to save you a whole world of pain, really. So hopefully this video helps you all a little bit. Otherwise, I'll see you for another video soon. Cheers.